Okay, this is going to be chapter 9 of Understanding Human Communication for the Shelton State Oral Communication class. And it's really interesting to me because a few editions ago, I think it was 9 or 10, we used to use this book. And then we switched over to a different book and we came back to it. But there was a time when they actually called this chapter Improving Interpersonal Relationships. And it was after understanding interpersonal communication, then we went to improving interpersonal relationships or improving interpersonal communication. They changed the title of this book to managing conflict in interpersonal relationships, and that's fine. That's all well and good because if we do manage the conflicts we have in our interpersonal relationships, then it does tend to improve them. Now it's really interesting, and it's very important that we notice the chapter title, managing conflict in interpersonal relationships. It does not say eliminating, it says managing. Because in almost every interpersonal relationship we will ever have, at some times or other in that relationship, there will be conflict. It is a natural part of it. Whether it's a good part of it or not, honestly, is depends on how that conflict is handled. And that's part of what we're going to talk about now. First of all, the definition of conflict, this book has some very good definitions. Interpersonal conflict is an expressed struggle between at least two interdependent parties who perceive incompatible goals, scarce resources, and interference from one another in achieving their goals. Now, in this chapter, the very first part of that, it talks about each one a little bit. Expressed struggle. If my wife wants to go somewhere for vacation and I want to go somewhere else, but when she says I'd like to go to Florida for vacation, I say fine. There's really no conflict. I haven't said anything about the fact that I wanted to go somewhere else or brought it up. We just go there, and that's fine. There's really not a conflict there. There has to be some sort of expression of the difference for there to be a conflict. An interdependence. There has to be an interdependence. If I want to go to Hawaii for vacation, and a friend of mine who I'm not related to, and we don't take vacations together, wants to go to France for vacation, well, guess what? There's no conflict because there's no interdependence there. We're not going anywhere together. Perceived incompatible goals. Let's just pretend for a moment that my wife wants to go to Orlando or Kissimmee for vacation, which is where my son lives in that area. And I want to go to Tampa because I want to go and look at some historic buildings there or some historic things there. That's not incompatible. We can go to Tampa. We could stay overnight. We could just visit for a day. We could go on to Orlando. So it's really not an incompatible goal. Perceived scarce resources. I like this one because it's fun to pretend. Let's just pretend I want to go to Australia for vacation and my wife wants to go to France for vacation. And we're independently wealthy. So what we do is we take a month off and we fly to Australia for a couple of weeks. We fly to Europe for a couple of weeks or France for a couple of weeks. And then we fly back. Really no reason for a struggle or a conflict because with all of those resources that we had in my theoretical framework right there, we got to do both anyway, so it didn't matter. So there has to be perceived scarce resources. Now, the book talks next about communication climates in interpersonal relationships. And this is very important because every relationship has a certain communication climate. It's the emotional tone of a relationship. It's expressed through messages that each partner sends and receives. And the book has a little measuring thing you can do, self-assessment on how sunny is your communication climate. You can go through that on your own. But the book does talk about the fact that we develop communication climates through sending out confirming and or disconfirming messages. That's what affects our climate. A confirming message might be a showing recognition, just acknowledging and saying hi. Acknowledging the other person's thoughts and feelings. Just stopping is it's a very confirming message just to stop and listen to somebody and let them talk to you for a little bit. And then the third step on that is actually indicating agreement with a person about something that they said. And that would be even more confirming. Now, disconfirming message is one, they deny the value of the other person. And of course, the opposite of confirming, disconfirming is not acknowledging that they exist. They walk by and say hi, and you just ignore them and keep walking. Very disconfirming message. And then not being willing to listen to the other person. Men are typically have this sort of stereotype of not being great listeners. Gentlemen, if we don't listen well, we send out if we're not willing to listen, we send out a disconfirming message about how much we value that other person, and that's not good. So there's a disconfirming message there. And then disagreeing can be disconfirming as well. However, there are other aspects to sending out disconfirming message besides that. Criticizing the other person is a very disconfirming message. Showing a certain level of contempt for the other person when you're actually insulting them in some way, and belittling them or ridiculing the other person. Being defensive about things that are said. That's something that can happen, and that can be a disconfirming type of message. One or both partners engage in stonewalling, where we just sort of avoid discussing something we know we need to talk about. That's problematic. That is problematic. And all of those, both the first three that I mentioned and these four, can all lead to very negative communication climates. Now, as communication climates develop, the book talks about there being relational spirals where we spiral in one way direction or another. We can spiral in a positive way, where one person says something positive, the other person says something positive back. We can spiral in a negative way. We can have what the book talks about as an escalatory spiral. It used to call it an escalatory conflict spiral, and I think that's a good way to put that. We send disconfirming messages, and then they just become bigger and bigger attacks on each other. That's very negative. Less obvious than that, and of course we can also de-escalate that, by the way. Someone can apologize, we can bring it back down. Less obvious than that, though, is the avoidance spiral. And I say less obvious, it really is obvious, but it's what you're doing is you're avoiding the other person or avoiding the topic instead of discussing the topic or being around the other person. And really, an avoidance spiral especially can be even more destructive at times than an escalatory, because if you're avoiding someone, not around them, then you're not around them to say, I'm sorry, I apologize, or whatever it might be. Where if you're around them and you're having an escalatory spiral, one of the or both people might decide to apologize. So anyway, creating a positive communication climate, some keys to that the book has. One is to avoid judgmental statements. Don't judge the other person, say, well, you always do this, you always do that, whatever it may be. Use I language. Own your own frustrations. Own your own emotions. I became frustrated when you did this or said this. I became upset when you said this or did this. Avoid attempts to control or manipulate the other people. There's nothing quite like knowing someone's trying to manipulate you to create a real problem in a relationship, or to control you. Real problem in a relationship. Some different approaches to conflict that people have. There's non-assertion, where nothing is said. There's indirect communication, which sort of hint about something being a problem. There's passive aggression, where they do things that we know are going to irritate the other person. And we kind of do that knowing that, although that may be a response to something they did, is our way of handling that disagreement that we have, but not necessarily in a positive way. Pseudo-accommodators pretend to agree with you, but then they just go on doing what they're doing. my example of this is imagine, say, a husband or a wife comes home and throws their jacket on the couch and leaves it, or on the chair and leaves it, throws it somewhere and leaves it. And the other one says, well, listen, it'd really be great if you could put that away when you get home. And the other one says, oh yeah, I'll do that from now on. But then they never do. That's a pseudo accommodator. Guilt makers try to make you feel bad. Well, I've done a whole lot for you, and it seems like, you could help me a little bit more. Really? Jokers use humor as a weapon. And then when they make a joke that hurts your feelings, and you say, well, I'm sorry, please don't say that, it hurt my feelings. Well, where's your sense of humor? Okay. Trivial tyrannizers do small things to drive you crazy. And they do them in ways where it can be seen as being accidental. Well, I didn't know that was going to bother you. Well, maybe. Withholders keep back something valuable. They withhold something from the other person, such as courtesy, affection, or humor. Then there's direct aggression, where you say something very specifically. You attack the other person's position, possibly. Assertion is actually where you handle it by expressing your needs, thoughts, and feelings very clearly and directly without judging others or dictating to them. Now, there is a time. This is one of my examples in classes. Imagine a husband and wife, and a 5-year-old child, and one of them smacks the child in the face, and the other person said, "Oh no, don't do that. Don't ever hit our child." And there's no negotiation point there. You don't negotiate. You never strike a child in the face. It's just not done. It's not right. And there's no point, there's no place for a gentle assertion or whatever like that. So don't do that again. There's a time for that, by the way. Characteristics of an assertive message: you describe the behavior in question, share your interpretation of their behavior, describe how it made you feel, describe the consequences of it, and then state your intentions about it for the future. And that all sounds fine, well, and good. And there's a time for that. And the book lays it out in a way almost as if it was the one ideal way to do it, and the others are not good. Well, maybe. But if a direct assertion, an assertion like that is going to start World War III, maybe something else is okay. Gender and conflict style. There are different ways that men and women handle conflict. The origins of those, some of those may be biological to some extent, but the way people are brought up, the way we sort of indoctrinate, if you will, little girls and little boys about what is and is not appropriate based on gender, can become a factor in how that plays out. Talks about conflict dilemmas, women having a double standard. If they're assertive, if they're assertive, they may be judged more harshly than men, but then they may be overlooked if they're not assertive. Problematic. All the differences aside, commonalities, the commonalities that we have in common outnumber the differences. Anyway, we're going to go forward a little bit now. Cultural influences on conflict. There are cultures in which we do not do conflict in person or in public, that is. Certain Asian and Eastern cultures, it's just not done. If you have a disagreement, that's something for the home, something that no one else sees then see. And yet in the Western cultures, we're a little bit more upfront and out front about some of the conflicts that we have. Not saying either one of those is good or bad. That's not my point. It's just a difference. Conflict and online communication. This is a little problematic. There's a delay, first of all. Unfortunately, in online communication, there's oftentimes a disinhibition. I had one Facebook account. I closed it and started a different Facebook account. Someone had felt free to criticize me publicly over something something I said. They criticized, and I thought, no, I didn't get on Facebook to be dressed down in public by someone that's a somewhat casual friend, not a best friend, that just felt free to do that. So I changed my Facebook accounts anyway. But there is a disinhibition, and here's an important thing: there is a permanence. There is a permanence on social media. You write something, and you there's a permanence there. You have to be careful about that, because a lot of employers watch social media, and they can watch social media. They can see you interact with someone in a certain way, and they might decide that's not necessarily how they want their company represented. The other thing is, if you've ever watched Judge Judy, you'll find out how many times people go on social media. Well, yeah, I know you owe you $500, but I'm not going to pay you. You can sue me. Take me to court. And then here, see, Judge Judy, this is what they said on Facebook. I cannot tell you how many times I have seen on some of these court shows on TV, especially Judge Judy, which is the one we watch the most. Someone wrote something on social media in their disagreement, acknowledged the debt, and thought, oh, well, came to the Judge Judy's house. I don't owe any money. Well, then why did you write this? Managing interpersonal conflicts and methods for conflict resolution. There's win-lose problem solving. I like win-lose problem solving. I do. I really do. When I win. I think we all do when we win. And there's a time for that. There are certain times where there really is no room for compromise. I mentioned the example of child abuse or something along that line. There's no room for compromise there. You have to win that argument. Lose-lose problem solving. Neither one of us get what we want. There may be a time for that as well. Compromise. There's usually room for compromise in most disagreements that we have. And then the book talks about win-win problem solving. That sounds ideal, doesn't it? Oh, we both win. Well, okay, it's rare. It's hard to do. It's rarely accomplished. Just to be blunt with you, it's rarely accomplished, but it is a nice idea. And it gives steps in win-win problem solving. Anytime a book gives steps in how to do something, typically they're presenting that as the best way to do it. And maybe it is, but it's tough to do. Steps in win-win problem solving: identify the problem, explore your unmet needs, Sit down and talk. It says make a date. You don't have to make a date ahead of time. So I say, hey, you have a few minutes so we can talk. Describe your problems and needs and make sure your partner understands that. Then solicit your partner's needs and then make sure check your understanding of that. Discuss some ways to meet your common goals. When you identify and define the conflict, you have to know what the conflict's about. Sometimes people argue about one thing, but that's just the surface. There's an underlying issue there that's really the problem. If you don't solve that problem, you're not going to solve the other. You're just not. So you have to define the conflict correctly. Generate a number of possible solutions. Try to evaluate the alternative solutions and decide on the best one. And in step 9, and here's the problem with this. Here's the problem with women in problem solving. You can do this. You can do this. Okay. And you get step number 1 through 8. Here we go. Here's a solution. Let's do this. Let's agree to this. Number 9, follow up on the solution. If even one person doesn't follow up on the solution, that's problematic. And so that is the end of chapter 8. And I will get this posted as well.